The role of the Soviet Union in fighting Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front was critical in helping the Allies win World War II. The bravery and sacrifice of the Soviet army and citizenry is well known, even legendary. Yet little mention is typically made of the Soviet Navy in World War II. In fact, many military experts, both then and later, thought little of the Soviet Navy. The commander of German naval forces in the Black Sea, Vice Admiral Helmuth Hay, was quoted in 1942 as saying that the initiative of the Russian fleet and its ability are estimated as slight. H.P. Wilmot, a respected modern naval historian who has written extensively about World War II, is of the opinion that, in terms of Soviet survival and victory in the Second World War, the Soviet Navy was largely irrelevant. But are those dismissive opinions about the Soviet Navy fair? Was the Navy of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics really that insignificant during World War II? This video should hopefully shed some light on that very question. To know and understand the geography of the Soviet Union is to appreciate what the Soviet Navy, or Red Navy as it was sometimes called, had to contend with. The Soviet Union's coastline was not only huge but more expansive than any other country on Earth. Its coastal areas extended to the Arctic Ocean to its north, the Baltic Sea to its west, Black Sea to its south, and Pacific Ocean to its east. Canada may have a longer coastline, but the entire coastline of the USSR was far more complex and extensive geographically. As such, guarding its coastline was always an enormous headache for the Soviet Navy, as it was for the equally vast Russian Empire that preceded it before the October Revolution of 1917. The Soviets organized their navy under 4 distinct fleets: the Northern Fleet to cover the Arctic region, including the Barents Sea near Norway, as well as the Baltic Fleet, Black Sea Fleet, and Pacific Fleet to cover those respective waters. Additionally, the Soviet Navy had a number of river flotillas across parts of the country. As with the rest of the Soviet economy in the late 1920s and 1930s, naval production was at the behest of the famous 5-year plans imposed by Joseph Stalin. The Navy's first 5-year plan commenced in November 1926. The plan was to construct 12 submersibles or submarines, 18 Coast Guard vessels, and 36 motor torpedo boats, or MTBs, as well as modernize 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers. There was also to be a further ramping up of the Soviet merchant navy, which had already commenced in earnest in 1925. The 1926 5-year plan was revised in 1929, with plans to also build 3 heavy cruisers, 10 submersibles, and 16 MTBs. The second 5-year plan for the Navy was launched in 1933. As one can tell, the Soviet 5-year plans were not exactly chronologically precise. Nevertheless, the 1933 plan included 355 new submersibles, 194 MTBs, and 4 river monitors, as well as 10 heavy squadron destroyers and 20 destroyer leaders. This was later revised to 49 destroyers, 9 destroyer leaders, 4 heavy cruisers, 155 submersibles, and 248 MTBs. However, it was in 1938 that the country's most ambitious 5-year plan for its navy was launched. In January 1938, the chairman of the Council of People's Commissars, Vyacheslav Molotov, stood before the Supreme Council of the USSR and declared how the country now needed a sea and ocean navy adequate for its interests and worthy of our great cause. At its core, this third 5-year plan wanted to turn the Soviet Navy from a purely defensive naval force to a resolutely offensive one. The ambitious plan was to build 19 battleships, 20 cruisers, 18 squadron destroyers, and 145 destroyers, as well as a further 341 submersibles and 514 MTBs. A further 44 river monitors would also be built to bolster the country's strong inland defenses. War was in the air by 1938, and the Soviet leadership knew the country needed a stronger navy. As such, this plan came directly under the control of Stalin himself. However, much of the plan had not been fully implemented by the time Hitler decided in 1941 to do a Napoleon and invade Russia, or to be more precise, the Soviet Union. As for the total tonnage of the Soviet Navy when war broke out in September 1939, it stood at cruisers with 29,297 tons, dreadnoughts at 75,000 tons, destroyers at 96,237 tons, and other vessels at 84,309 tons. The largest class of Soviet naval vessels was submarines, with a total tonnage of 119,594. Submarines were divided into three classes: oceanic, medium coastal, and light coastal. But the Soviet Navy remained vulnerable. Besides delayed shipbuilding, there was another hugely influential factor that had stunted the Soviet Navy's progress. It was a uniquely Soviet factor and one that had devastated huge swathes of the Soviet Union. That factor was the widespread and murderous purges ordered by Stalin in the 1930s and, in particular, between 1935 and 1938. It was at this time that Stalin sought out to rid the country of all his adversaries and critics, whether real or imagined, be they political figures, intellectuals, or military leaders. Millions of people lost their careers, with many of them imprisoned, tortured, and exiled. Hundreds of thousands would be executed. The purge of military leaders, officers, and specialists was especially fierce against the Soviet Army. Countless officers and their subordinates were purged. Although on a smaller scale, given that the army was far larger, the Soviet Navy also suffered from Stalin's purges. The result was thousands of vacant leadership roles throughout the Soviet Navy, which left the Navy crippled and horribly understaffed by the advent of war. Mad scrambles took place from 1939 onwards to try and rectify the huge gaps left because of the purges. Even Stalin himself, forever the opportunistic, bombastic dictator that he was, turned on the purges in 1939, declaring them a threat to the very survival of the Soviet Union. No kidding. The purges were a leading reason of why the Soviet Union's army and navy proved incapable of resisting the first waves of German invasion in 1941. And it is to Operation Barbarossa that we now must turn. Hitler was obsessed with invading the USSR. By 1941, Germany was winning the war on the Western Front and its U-boats still creating havoc in the Battle of the Atlantic. Britain was on its knees, France had capitulated, most of Europe was under German control, or proxy, and the United States had still not entered the war. And so Hitler decided the time was ripe to invade the USSR, which Germany did on June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa was a go. As already discussed, the Soviet Union, including its navy, was not prepared for the might of the Third Reich's war machine. The navy had been further crippled by the transfer of 390,000 experienced sailors to the Red Army, a desperate measure in response to the early German invasion. Additionally, 230,000 more sailors were seconded to the Red Army to serve as naval infantry. These experienced sailors would fight side by side with ordinary infantrymen. They became an integral part of the Red Army throughout the remainder of the war. This naval infantry component of the Soviet military was arguably more extensive than that of any other major power during the war. When the Germans invaded, the Soviets had 2 flotillas in the Baltic, 3 in the Black Sea, and 1 in the White Sea or Arctic region. Her fleet included 15 2,900-ton destroyers of the Leningrad class and 35 1,800-ton destroyers of the Stremitelny class, which were designed in Italy. The Soviet Navy also had 8 cruisers, with 4 of them being modern 8,000-ton vessels of the Kirov class, which were completed in 1941. These cruisers weren't particularly active in the war, with them being mostly involved in the bombing of German positions in the Baltic and Crimea region of the Black Sea. The Soviet Union had two 35,000-ton battleships under construction when Germany invaded. One of them was captured by the Germans on the Black Sea in August 1941, while another under construction in Leningrad is assumed to have been destroyed by the Soviets before the Germans were able to invade that city, which is today St. Petersburg. The Soviets also had an estimated 200-plus submarines. These would be particularly active against German vessels in the Baltic Sea. They were less successful in the Black Sea and Arctic region, with the all-Soviet vessels coming under relentless attack by German U-boats, battleships, and naval aircraft sorties. The Soviets started to get the upper hand against the Germans from 1942 onwards. The Soviet Navy played an instrumental part in this turnaround in Soviet military fortunes. For example, the Soviet Navy had always invested heavily in river gunboats and had several river flotillas. These proved highly effective in the latter part of the war against Germany. The largest of them was the Danube River Flotilla, which had been wiped out by the Germans in 1941. By 1944, the flotilla had been completely reconstituted and was instrumental in helping drive the Germans out of Budapest in Hungary and Belgrade in Yugoslavia, both of which had been Nazi-occupied until then. Smaller flotillas also engaged in defensive and offensive battles on the rivers Don, Kuban, and Amur. Soviet gunboats were also used extensively in lake excursions, such as on Lake Ladoga, the largest freshwater lake in Europe. One flotilla of Soviet armored gunboats based on the River Spree even played an active role in the battle to capture Berlin in 1945. A critical part of the Soviet Navy's mission throughout the war was indeed defensive. In particular, the Navy was active in the defense of merchant shipping to and from its allies. These convoys were critical to the very survival of the besieged and exhausted Soviet Union. Not surprisingly, the Germans did make convoys to the Soviet Union a major offensive focus, particularly against the Allied shipping routes to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk in the Arctic region. Even so, 4 million tons of cargo were successfully delivered to Russia's Arctic North, with a further 4.2 million tons sent through the Persian Gulf and an impressive 8 million tons channeled via Vladivostok on the Pacific Ocean in Russia's Far East. The Soviets did get lucky. For some reason, the mighty German Navy, or Kriegsmarine, never engaged on a large scale with the Red Navy. It's not as if the Kriegsmarine were completely disengaged in the war against the Soviet Union. It was. For example, German vessels were actively involved in blockading Soviet ports by laying minefields in the Baltic, Black Sea, and Arctic region, as well as unfurling huge anti-submarine nets in the Baltic by 1943. However, that was mostly it. As heard with the quote by a German admiral at the beginning of this video, we know that the German Naval High Command had total disdain for the Soviet Navy, and the Germans were furiously battling the Allies in the Atlantic. Yet relative German inaction on the naval front against the USSR was puzzling. There's no denying that the Soviets did get an important reprieve due to the relatively contained actions of the Kriegsmarine. Exactly what the combined four Soviet fleets accomplished during World War II is debated to this day. Estimates vary, sometimes quite substantially. The reason for this lack of consistency regarding the achievements of the Red Navy has to do with the extreme secrecy of the Soviet Union at the time, not to mention during the later Cold War. One thing historians and pundits do agree on is that the Navy of the Soviet Union was strongly defensive. For one thing, as already mentioned, Soviet naval vessels were very active in the protection of convoys to and from the country via every possible sea route. Most Soviet naval losses were as a consequence of these convoy operations, with vessels being lost to German minefields and torpedoes from U-boats and warships alike, not to mention fire overhead by the German Luftwaffe. For another, it's acknowledged that the Red Navy also played a significant role in preventing the breaching of Red Army defensive lines in both the Baltic and Black Sea regions. Soviet sailors and naval infantrymen were very active in amphibious operations and the bombardment of coastal areas, as well as in the evacuation of troops, once again, particularly in the Baltic and Black Sea regions. One of the disputed statistics pertains to how much damage Soviet vessels did to enemy shipping. According to Admiral Isakov of the Red Navy, it was claimed that Soviet vessels of the Northern Fleet sank 1.5 million tons of enemy shipping, a statistic that is not easily verified. The Soviets claimed even greater success with their Baltic Sea, asserting that Soviet vessels sank in excess of 2 million tons of enemy shipping in that region, mostly thanks to their legion of submarines and motor torpedo boats. One statistic that has been verified is that the Soviet Navy destroyed some 200 enemy troop and supply ships during the massive Battle of Sevastopol that took place between April and May 1944. On the other hand, the Soviets lost a host of vessels in battles against Germany's 3rd minesweeping flotilla in the Kerch Straits between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov in November 1943. There were other heavy losses incurred by the Red Navy. For example, 16 of the 25 Soviet destroyers in the Baltic had been sunk by the end of 1941. In the White Sea of the Arctic region, 5 out of 8 Soviet destroyers were lost. The Black Sea Fleet didn't fare much better, losing 15 out of its 19 modern and older destroyers in the region. A Soviet ship was lost either to a mine or bomb nearly every time. So, to conclude, was it fair to say that the Soviet Navy played an insignificant role in the Soviet Union's success in the Second World War? No, that would be an unfair assessment. Although not as hugely influential as the navies of Britain, the United States, and Germany, the Red Navy still played an active part in the defense and then later multiple offensives conducted by the USSR. The U.S. Naval Institute, or USNI, is certainly of that opinion. It states, often discounted in the history books, the Red Navy was crucial to the success of the Soviet Union in World War II. There's no denying that the sheer scale of the Soviet Army and the tenacity of its soldiers is what won the Eastern Front against Germany. Yet the Soviet Navy undoubtedly played its role in securing that victory. As with so much in war, and especially World War II, the truth is often far more complex and nuanced than even historians care to acknowledge.